Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I am Mike Belsito, and I'm here today because I'm living proof that the concept that you have to move to a place like Silicon Valley or New York to raise $1 million for your startup company, that's bullshit. You don't have to do that. You don't have to move to Silicon Valley. You don't even need to raise $1 million to get your startup funded and get it off the ground yourself, right? Now, we did with eFuneral. We raised close to $1 million in startup funding when we got going. And we did it when we were proud to call Cleveland our home. We were founded right here in Cleveland. But when I think back of what we had to go through to do that, there's a lot that we learned. And in fact, I want to share a lot of that with you, share our learnings across the way. But I think it's important to start from the very beginning first. And I'll start by going back to this building, which was the home of a little liquor store on the bottom and the home of Findaway World on the top, 23 Bell Street in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. And this was a place that was very special to me, although I should really come clean. It wasn't a liquor store. It was a fancy wine and cheese shop, but the story sounds way cooler when we describe it as a liquor store, right? So Findaway was the first stop on the startup train that I got on about 10 years ago. And I was really fortunate and grateful to be one of the very first Findawayers there, one of the first employees that they brought on board. And by the way, this company still exists here in Northeast Ohio. They employ over 100 people. Interesting startup story there, yep. But in the beginning, I like to think that as Findaway was growing and developing as a company, I like to think that I was growing and developing as a future founder, right? But that said, there were other people like me. About a year after I joined Findaway World, they recruited one of their first full-time software developers, Brian Chaikin. And he was in the same position as me, right? Just like Findaway was growing and developing, just like I was growing and developing, Brian was growing and developing in a couple different ways, but also as a future founder, right? And as time went on, after a few years, Findaway kept asking itself the question, well, hey, what's the next Playaway? Playaway is the original product that we launched that we were successful with. What is that next Playaway? And they put Brian and me in charge of trying to answer that question by launching new products. And so after about 5 years when I started in Findaway, Brian and I started working together to bring new products to life. And we did. We brought a couple of new products to life for the company. But as Brian and I were bringing new products to life, my family unexpectedly experienced a death. It was the death of my cousin Ed. And totally out of the blue, Ed was a younger guy. And right away, we were faced with that challenge. What do we do now, right? Near where Ed lived, there were about 5 funeral homes within 2 miles. We didn't know which was better than the other. We didn't know how much one of those funeral homes charged, what other families had to say. So we were pretty much stuck, right? We didn't have the time to visit or call every single one of those funeral homes. My dad actually was the one that made the suggestion, hey, maybe we should look online, right? I mean, I'm sure we could find some of this information we're looking for online. And so we did that, and this is what we found. This is a real website, by the way. This is a real funeral home website. We definitely didn't find the information that we were looking for. We found other funeral home websites that were maybe a little bit better than this, but not much better. And we found some national sites that had information about all the funeral homes throughout the country, but not real information. These were listing sites, right? There wasn't information about pricing. There weren't reviews from other families that have used those funeral homes in the past, right? So I remember being at dinner with my wife after Ed's service took place. Eventually, we ended up just picking a funeral home and hoping for the best. But I'm at dinner after the service took place, and the only reason why my wife and I were at that restaurant was because of reviews that I read for it online. And that's when it dawned on me. We as a society, we have more information to decide where to go to dinner, spend $30, $40, than something that's so much more important, like planning a funeral service. And by the way, so much more expensive. A funeral can cost over $10,000. So I remember getting back to Findaway and bringing this up with Brian and just talking about the experience that my family went through, and it didn't sit right with him either. And soon that led to meeting in the morning over coffee to talk about it. Soon it meant we met over weekends. And we were trying now to ask ourselves, hey, can we come up with a solution for this big problem? And before we knew it, we decided that that's what we had to do. In fact, we went off on our own and decided to develop that solution, which ultimately became eFuneral. But I should say, this wasn't a snap decision that we made. In fact, it was months of this meeting. It was months of talking about this big problem with each other and with mentors that we had in our life. And we had and still have some amazing mentors. And I remember finding out about the 10 Accelerator, which was an accelerator that was just getting started in Columbus, Ohio. It was the first state-backed accelerator here in Ohio. And they were offering $20,000 as a grant and mentorship from some of Ohio's best entrepreneurs and investors to find 10 companies to uproot themselves and put themselves in Columbus for that very summer, the summer of 2011. I remember our mentors challenging us. They said, hey, if you guys are serious about that accelerator, if you guys are serious about eFuneral, and you apply and you get in to that accelerator, we'll match what you got as a grant with an investment of our own. And so we ended up doing just that. We got into the 10 Accelerator program, and before we knew it, we were at demo day, graduating from the 10 Accelerator, raising enough to build a small team of our own so that we could ultimately build and launch the actual solution that we had come up with. And we did that ultimately in February of 2012. And our solution was we would build a place that people could go to online to get access to information they need to make more informed funeral planning decisions. We provided reviews, we provided pricing information, and we did this all in one place online. And I will say, when we first launched, there was some fanfare, right? This is the only place online that you could get that sort of information. However, over time, we started to really gain some traction in certain places. I will say the hospice community was one of those places where they thought our service was actually very useful, right? Now, I should explain, hospice organizations are very protective of the patients that they serve. They're not used to introducing new products and new services because of how protective they are of their families. But they loved eFuneral. Dozens of hospice organizations throughout the entire country were recommending eFuneral to families. So we were gaining good traction there. But on the business side, on the revenue side, we really struggled. Now, we generated revenue with the initial model that we had launched with, which was families use our service for free, but funeral homes can be in our network and pay when we bring them a family, when we bring them business. And on paper, that sounded real nice, but we struggled with that. And so we made a pivot after pivot after pivot, right? Trying to find the right revenue model. Soon enough, after about 2 years after launching, it became evident that we were nearing the end of our runway, and we weren't venture ready by any means. Could we approach current investors and ask for more money or new angel investors? Candidly, it didn't feel right to do that. We weren't at that point where we were ready to go down that path. So ultimately, we decided, and it was a difficult decision, but we decided, let's see if we could find a much bigger company and acquire some of what we built. So at least we could keep some of what we built alive. We knew that this would be the end for us, right? And sure enough, this past May, Homesteaders Life Company, which is a 100-year-old funeral life insurance company that's a pretty big player in the space, they acquired many of the assets of eFuneral, but this was not Facebook buying WhatsApp, right? This was what I would call, maybe a fail sale. But it did allow us to keep some of what we built alive. It did allow us to return something back to certain investors that had invested in eFuneral. And what I will say is I'll never take back the last 3 years of my life because we learned so much in that process. Now, we're here to talk about fundraising, right? So we learned a little bit about that too as we went on throughout eFuneral. And so I want to get into the meat of those learnings. Now, all told, we did raise close to $1 million, which most people would consider, right, a seed round. But that's deceiving because when you say we raised a seed round, that sounds like it was all done in one fell swoop. One of the things that we learned is in places like Cleveland and likely other areas of the Rust Belt, that's not likely. Raising, it's not as if you just put a profile up on Angel List and automatically get $1 million in investment overnight. That's just not how it works. At least it wasn't how it worked for us, right? It's $20,000 here, $50,000 there, $100,000 there. It's a long process. It's not just one step. It's a long process. The other thing that we learned is investors, especially here in the Rust Belt, I would like to think everywhere, they invest not in ideas. They invest in businesses. And that should make sense, right? But what I mean by that is it's not just an idea. It's not just sitting down with an investor and giving a pitch about some sort of idea that's in your head. They want something tangible. What you'll notice is most of the money that we raised actually came after we launched a fully fledged product. Now, even in the very beginning, money that we raised from our mentors and the 10 Accelerator, that didn't come at idea stage. That actually came at prototype stage. We didn't raise a penny from anybody until we had a fully baked out prototype that wasn't just a back of the napkin sketch. It was something that looked real, it felt real. It was something that we could communicate, this is the product, right? The other thing that I learned is location sort of matters, and then it sort of doesn't. Now, I say it sort of matters because, at least in our experience, we learned that investors do like to invest in the proximity of where they're at, right? They want to be close to the action. They're not investing just in your business. They're buying your dream. They're buying your vision. And so they want to be able to meet you for a cup of coffee if that's possible. They want to be able to stop in at your office and talk to you about your business. So that's one of the reasons why we found a lot of our investment came from really close to where we were located. But it's not an absolute. And that's why I say it sort of doesn't matter, because I've certainly met seed investors that invest outside of their geography. And I think it's interesting that you'll see some of the funding that we got, not very much, but some of that funding came from out of Ohio. Well, it just so happened that the only venture capital group to invest in eFuneral came from not Cleveland, not Columbus, but Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, I think a mistake that some founders make, especially early on, is confining themselves just to that local geography. Now, it's important, and I think it's a good thing to concentrate on your local geography when talking to investors, but you have to expand your horizons too. Had we not even thought to talk to investors that were outside of Ohio, we would have never met the venture capital group that invested in us, who, by the way, if we were able to get to that point where we could have proven out a sustainable revenue model, they could have been a great candidate to lead our Series A. But if we would have just mentally confined ourselves to Northeast Ohio or Ohio in general, that would have never happened. Now, we experienced a bit of a domino effect. And what we realized is not all investment dollars are created equal. Now, every investor you meet will like to tell you that they're value add, and some of them are, and some of them aren't, right? For us, like I said, we had amazing mentors, and I would say in the very beginning for us, the money that we raised from mentors and even the 10 Accelerator, that wasn't in the grand scheme of things monumental for us in terms of the amount that we raised, right? It was less than $100,000. It was less than 10% overall of what we raised. However, for us, that might have been the most meaningful money that we took in at all. Because when we went to the 10 Accelerator, we actually already had people that had great entrepreneurial backgrounds that had invested in us. And you better believe that the professional investors that we talked to when we were in that Accelerator took notice. And that led to other great conversations with professional investors and even, frankly, friends and family, right? For friends and family to know that this isn't something that's just some concoction that we made up, like real, legitimate people believe in it enough to invest in it. It made some of those friends and family members that had invested confident enough to invest as well. One thing to note here, though, is you see that over half of what we raised came from organizations. Now, in a place like Silicon Valley, that would be confusing, or at least it might be misleading, because you would think, well, organizations, maybe that's venture capital groups, but that's not what I mean there, right? I'm talking about entrepreneurial organizations that exist here in Northeast Ohio to support investing in startups. Now, there are organizations that invested in us, like Jumpstart, the Northeast Ohio Innovation Fund, North Coast Opportunities Technology Fund. These groups invest in early stage tech startups to try to spur investment from other investors in these startups as well. And that is what happened with us to some extent, right? What I will say is a mistake that many first-time founders make is to ignore some of those organizations altogether because the downside, and there is a downside, there's a lot of hoops to jump through, right? It takes a long time to go through that process. You do have meeting after meeting after meeting. But guess what? It's real capital. It's real money that's just sitting there waiting to go to entrepreneurs. And maybe it's not right for everybody, but what I will say is if you ignore it completely, it's a missed opportunity. For us, we were grateful to be able to take advantage of all of the opportunities that were here in Northeast Ohio. And this is specific to places like the Rust Belt, where we know that we have to do more to sort of help and boost up that startup ecosystem here. So I'm grateful that these organizations exist. Just keep in mind, they're not kingmakers, right? You don't have to get an investment from Jumpstart to be successful. It doesn't guarantee you're going to be successful anyway. But if you overlook it altogether, it's a missed opportunity. Now, as far as pitching goes, as far as when we're sitting in front of whether it's an angel investor, as far as these organizations, I have been inspired by somebody, Simon Sinek, who has a concept, start with why. And we made a mistake in the beginning. We would always lead with our what or our how, right? We're an online platform that connects families in need with funeral homes, and we're going to grow by partnering with hospice organizations and blah, blah, blah. When we would pitch like that, people, eyes would gloss over. Not a lot of people were listening. But when we changed the way that we talked, when it was the funeral planning process is broken, eFuneral brings transparency by providing information that families can use to make more informed decisions. Well, that's a little bit different, right? And actually, I didn't even say what it was that we did or how we're going to do it. But that comes later, right? We got people interested in the why behind eFuneral, and then they were interested to hear about the what and the how. So that was important for us. What I will say, though, is along the process, you're going to get advice from so many different people. Everybody loves to give advice. Your investors, your mentors, your advisors, friends, family, spouses. It's important to consider the source, right? So, for example, and this wasn't us, but if you're a consumer app company, let's just say an iPhone app business, right, that you're launching, your business is all built around iPhone apps. You're going to get feedback from people that are important to you, but have they successfully deployed iPhone apps in the past? If the answer is no, well, take it with a grain of salt, right? I'm sure there's good feedback you're going to get, but it doesn't make them an expert at what it is that you're doing. So make sure that you understand that it's up to you to know who to trust, and it's also up to you to know when you should trust your gut. I'll say of the decisions that I made in the past with eFuneral, there were decisions where I conferred with 10 different people to get feedback, but the decisions that I made where I trusted my gut and I just went with it, I don't regret any of those decisions at all. And so I would tell other first-time founders, don't underestimate trusting your gut. But remember, investors are people too, right? So investors aren't just people that are writing you a check and they give you the check and it's money in the bank. Again, like I mentioned before, they're buying your dream. They're buying your vision. Make sure that you keep them in the loop. Share the good, but also the bad and the ugly. And that's where a lot of times people make a mistake, right? It's easy to share the same type of information that anybody on the street would ask you, hey, how's business going? Oh, it's going great. You have to share more with that investors. You have to keep them in the loop. We made sure to keep our investors informed through an investor blog that we put together. Every time we made an update, which was every week or two, they would get a notification. In the body of the email, they would see the update. And whether it was good, bad, whatever, they would, and that wasn't the extent of our conversations with investors. Those would lead to phone conversations, to coffee meetings. But it really helped because when the times got tough, many of our investors were right there with us in the trenches. They had their sleeves rolled up trying to help us figure out how do we get out of the situation that we were in right then. The other thing that we learned is in a place like Cleveland, people want to believe. People want to believe in the dream, and you should take advantage of that, right? Everybody's looking for a success story here. And we have our own success stories. They might still be early in the writing of them, but we have them. And when I'm at places like TechPint or when I meet with groups like Jumpstart, what I'm realizing is people are looking for reasons to think that your startup can be that success story. Now, I'll never forget when I had a conversation with one of our investors. This person I wasn't previously connected to before starting eFuneral, but I had to give him the news that we were winding eFuneral down. That wasn't an easy conversation for me, but I had to give him that news. And he said, well, you want to know what? Let me know when you start your next company because I want to invest in that. And that meant a lot to me, but one of the things it reminded me of is we're in the right place as startup founders. Things are turning for the better in Cleveland, in Columbus, and other Rust Belt cities. That conversation alone made me realize that. Now, I know this talk is titled How to Raise $1 Million Outside of Silicon Valley, but one of the things I want to leave with you is you don't have to raise $1 million to get your startup off the ground. I mean, ask yourself these questions. Could you figure out how to get money from customers, prepaying? Do you have a product idea where maybe you could use crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter or Fundable? There are other ways to bootstrap your business and get your business off the ground. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't raise money from investors? No, for certain people, I think it could make absolute sense. Just know that investment isn't the destination. A successful business, that's the destination. And there's multiple paths to get there. And maybe raising money should be the last path that you consider. So I want you to keep that in mind. Now, finally, in sort of as I finish up here, I want to remind you that, again, in a place like Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Detroit or Columbus, the good news is, if you feel like you do need to raise funding for your business, you can do that in any one of those Rust Belt cities. We proved that out. You don't have to move to Silicon Valley. You don't have to move to New York. You don't even have to be a genius. And I think especially on that last point, I'm living proof of that. But if you want to talk more about this topic, it's obviously something that I'm pretty passionate about. I'll be here for a little while more. And also you could reach me online. And I always love a good cup of coffee. So hopefully we can meet up then too. Thank you.